want to welcome everybody to our fourth fall Missouri River Water Management Public Meeting, fourth in 4 days. Fourth of 7 as we'll wrap up down at the mouth in St. Louis on Thursday morning. I took over command of Northwestern Division in July. I've had some limited engagement with stakeholders in the Basin, so this trip is a great opportunity. I'm learning a ton as we have broader and deeper discussions about the many challenges that we have throughout the Basin, and I hope we'll continue those conversations this afternoon. I understand it's been 2 years since we last had in-person meetings, and obviously a lot's changed in the Basin since those last face-to-face events. In 2019, we were dealing with near-record runoff and severe flooding, and of course now we're experiencing severe drought in the upper Basin and drought throughout much of the entirety of the river. Of course, I just want to remind everybody that the Missouri River main stem reservoir system is designed to serve all 8 of the authorized purposes in both flood years and during times of drought. And we'll talk about how we're handling that in some of the technical briefings that will follow here momentarily. And the water management staff will provide additional detail as well on the current and forecasted conditions after I finish up, and then after John Remus kind of gives you a more detailed introduction. Before we begin the technical portion of the meeting, I'd like to introduce the core staff in attendance. So we've got John Remus from the Missouri River Water Management Office, and Kevin Grody, Mike Swenson as well. Behind him is Colonel Mark Himes, who's the commander of the Omaha District, of course, your local Corps of Engineers district, and he is the current commander. Behind him, you've got Kayla Eckert-Upmore, the Chief of Civil Works for Omaha District. Let me see, I'm scanning the crowd. And then we've got folks in the back, so we've got, if you just put up your hand when I get to you, we've got Anthony Huddleston, the Chief of Emergency Management for Omaha. We've got, let's see, Sheila Newman, who is the Chief of Operations for the district. And then from the Gavin's Point project itself, we've got Michael Welsh, Mike Nuss, and Martin Gotting. Okay, great. And then we have our Public Affairs Officer, Eileen Williamson, over there as well. So with that, thanks again to all of you for coming today, and I'll turn the meeting over to John Remus to kick off the more detailed part of the session. Thanks.
We posted our 2021-2022 draft annual operating plan last month on our website. You're welcome to go read that, comment on that. You can also leave us comments tonight based on what you've heard here tonight. You can leave us, you can do it in the form of a question here, which we'll take notes and record, or you can fill out a comment form, which is on the table outside the room here, and give it to us tonight, or you can take one with you and mail it to us. I always find out when I go to a public meeting that I leave it and say, boy, I wish I'd said this, or I wish I'd have left a comment about that. So you can do that, or you can email us. Our email address is on the last slide in the slide packet, and it's also on some business cards that are on the table outside, or you can just do a web search on Corps of Engineers Missouri River Water Management, and we'll be the top one there. We recognize that this is mostly a water management meeting, but there may be some other issues that you would like to bring up relative to the river. We may not be able to answer those questions, but we will take those questions back and try to get you the answer as best we can at another time. With that, I think I will turn it over to Kevin Grody to start the technical side of the presentation. Oh, ma'am, you're going to talk about this.
Yeah. My name is Kevin Grody, and this says Kevin Lau. So Kevin Lau is with the National Weather Service. We are partners with the National Weather Service, another federal agency. We communicate with them on a regular basis. We use a lot of their products in our analysis, into our regulation of the main stem system, and so we have a lot of communication with them. The National Weather Service has some very strict COVID restrictions, and they're not allowed to travel. So I reached out to Kevin, so Kevin and Kevin had a discussion, and he actually put together a script for me. So I'm going to read from that script, and these are Kevin's words, Kevin Lau's words, as we described these products. So much of the Missouri River Basin has continued to see below normal precipitation over the past 3 months, and that's depicted in this graphic right here, as well as over the past 6 months, and that's depicted with this graphic. Many areas have received only 25 to 70% of normal precipitation over these time periods. So far, calendar year 2021 has been the 26th driest year on record for the past 127 years of record keeping. The below normal precipitation has resulted in very dry soils over the basin, and that is depicted in this graphic. The deepest Burgundy area in northeast Montana, right up here, represents the driest 1% of the modeled record. The yellow areas rank in the driest 30%. The lack of moisture has led to 65% of the Missouri Basin being categorized in some level of drought, and that's represented in this table right here, and I apologize, it's probably very, very hard to read on your graphic. So looking ahead over the course of the next 3 months, NOAA believes the ongoing drought will persist into 2022 for much of the Missouri Basin, and that's shown with this right here, this dark brown. And the legend right over here shows drought persists in the dark brown. However, drought may expand in the yellow areas in western Kansas and eastern Colorado, which is right here. That's what he's talking about, this area right there. But conditions are expected to improve in central Montana, and that's shown right up here. So far, 2021 has been the 25th warmest year in the Missouri Basin in 127 years of record keeping. This warmer than normal trend is expected to continue in western and southern portions of the Missouri Basin for the month of November, and that's represented with this brown colors here. However, you will note that the northern portion of the basin is shaded in white in the upper left-hand graphic right here. That's what he's talking about. This means that climate signals are not strong enough to cause odds to favor above, below, or near normal temperatures. We just don't know. The precipitation trend expected in November is showing in this lower graphic. Again, much of the basin appears in white, meaning that there could be normal, above normal, or below normal precipitation. He's talking about this area right here. The climate signals are just not strong enough to allow us to say what is likely to happen. You will note, however, that above normal precipitation is slightly favored during November right here in Wyoming and Montana. So looking ahead to the 3-month period of November, December, and January, warmer than normal temperatures are expected to continue in the southern half of the basin. So again, it's this brown area right here. And just as we saw on the last slide with the 1-month November outlook, climate signals cannot provide a strong indication as to the temperature trends over the northern half of the basin for the next 3 months. So what he's talking about is this equal chances part right here. The white area indicates there is just as much chance for warmer as there is for lower than normal, or just near normal temperatures through January. And just as we saw with the 1-month November outlook, the lower right-hand graphic indicates that for the bulk of the basin, and he's talking about this right here, we just don't know what precipitation will be over the next 3 months. However, just like the 1-month November outlook, odds continue to favor above normal precipitation in the northern Rockies over the next 3 months. So again, he's pointing to this right here. And this is in keeping with the expectation of La Nina conditions. So last Thursday, on the 21st of October, NOAA's Climate Prediction Center released the 2021-22 U.S. Winter Outlook. Now the URL shown right here is very long. So you could just get to this by typing in U.S. Winter Outlook into your search engine. La Nina conditions are expected to return for a second time in a row. No two La Ninas behave the same, but in general, La Ninas leans towards cooler than normal temperatures in the northern portion of the basin and leans toward an above normal snowpack in Montana and Wyoming. Now, Kevin says caution. We're saying leans toward, not guarantee. No two La Ninas are the same, but La Nina typically means for us that it will be cold in the north and favors a good snowpack in the northern Rockies. So to summarize, he's indicating that a very dry and warm year has led to soil moisture deficits and a persistent drought throughout the Missouri Basin. Warmer than normal temperatures are expected to continue into January for at least the southern half of the basin. And the National Weather Service is really not sure about what temperature trends will be for the northern half of the basin. While chances do favor a wet winter in the northern Rockies, there is no good sign or no good signal to indicate precipitation trends over the majority of the basin for the next 3 months. They released their winter outlook, and they are indicating with a La Nina that typically leads to colder than normal temperatures in the northern states and above normal snowpack in Wyoming and Montana. And again, he says no guarantees. And finally, the National Weather Service will be issuing their spring flood outlooks beginning in February of 2022. So we'll move on to the other portion of the presentation that I'm going to give, and it's about runoff. Now we start with the authorized purposes of the system. And there are 8 authorized purposes: flood control, navigation, water supply, hydropower, fish and wildlife, irrigation, recreation, and water quality control. Now you may note that we have these 3, flood control, navigation, and water supply, on top. That does not mean those are our favorites. We don't have a favorite. Why we have those on top is that the majority of the decisions we make when it comes to regulating the system are based on these 3 purposes: flood control, navigation, and water supply. When we make those regulation decisions, we are also serving the other 5 authorized purposes. And finally, I want to note that all federal laws are complied by the Corps when we regulate the system. So I've used the word system a couple times already. This graphic represents the system. In other words, if you took all 6 of the projects and put them into one, you combined all the water that's in all 6 projects. Because some of the decisions we make when it comes to how we're going to meet those authorized purposes is based on how much water we have in the system. Hence, we call it system storage. When it comes to the system, we have 4 zones. We have a permanent pool, which is the minimum amount of water we need to serve some authorized purposes such as hydropower. We have the carryover multiple use zone, which is the largest zone in the system. And we think of this as like a bank account that we use during long extended droughts. The top zone is the exclusive flood control zone. And just as the name implies, when we're in that zone, our regulation decisions are exclusively based on flood control. This is a zone we like to be in 365 days out of the year, the annual flood control and multiple use zone. Ideally, we'd start the runoff season, which is on or about March 1st right here at the base. And as we saw the plains snow melt and the rainfall in March and April, we see the storage increase. And then as we get into May, June, and July, and the mountain snowpack is melting and the rainfall is occurring, we would peak in early to mid-July. And then during the drier months of August, September, October, November, December, all the way back to March 1st again, we'd slowly meter that water out to meet all the authorized purposes. You can see this is where we're at right now. 6 million acre feet into this bank account to get us through a long extended drought. So I've already touched on the runoff components, where we get the water that fills up the reservoirs. We have the plain snowpack, which usually melts in March and April, sometimes earlier. And we have mountain snowpack, which melts in May, June, and July. We also get rainfall during those 5 months. So during this 2 months here of March and April, we normally see about 25% of the annual runoff into the upper basin. During May, June, and July is when we see about 50%. So in that 5-month period is when we see about 75% of the total runoff. The other 25% comes in the other 7 months. Our forecast, which is an October 1 forecast, we will update it on November 1st, we'll update it on December 1st. But our October 1st forecast is 14.8 million acre feet, which is a lower decile runoff. So it's in the bottom 10%. We will start looking at the 2022 runoff in early January. So this is where that 14.8 stacks up against the last 123 years of record. And when I talk about the upper basin, I'm talking about above Sioux City, Iowa. So here we are right here with 2021, 14.8. This is the lower decile line, which means 10% below, 90% above. So we have upper decile, upper quartile. Quartile is just 25% above, 75% below, and medium, 50%, 50%. Mike is going to talk a little bit more about those during his part of the presentation. But you can see that during this period, we've had great variability in runoff in the last 123 years. And you can also see here these extended periods. We've had 4 extended droughts in the basin since the system, or since 1898. And finally, fall and winter releases. So system storage on July 1st called for us to start some water conservation measures. We decreased the service level a little bit, about 1,500 CFS. We did not shorten the navigation season. So we have a full 8-month season, which ends on December 1st at the mouth. And that means we're going to start decreasing releases out of Gavin's Point on November 22nd. During the wintertime, as we always do, we closely monitor the channel conditions below each one of the reservoirs, and especially downstream of Gavin's Point. During our September 1 storage check, that indicated that winter releases out of Gavin's Point would be at a minimum level of 12,000 CFS. So we are looking at 3 of the projects right here with expected average monthly releases. Now, this is what we're showing in our studies. And you can see that I have 12,500, and you're thinking, well, wait a minute, you just said 12,000 here. How come you have 12,500? And what we normally do during the wintertime out of Gavin's Point is when we see really, really cold weather come in, and we might see some ice jamming on the Missouri River, we increase the releases out of Gavin's Point for a short period of time just to lessen the chance for ice jams. And so that 12,500 indicates that we anticipate that occurring during those 3 months. And I will turn it over to Mike.
Okay, I'm going to continue our presentation by talking about the results of our 2021 regulation and then looking out to next year for the authorized purposes. First, a snapshot of where we are in the upper 3 reservoirs and then also Fort Randall. You can see that Fort Peck, Garrison, and Oahe are 6.7, 6.8, and 10 feet below the base of their annual flood control zones. Over the next few months, we'll adjust the releases at these projects and bring these a little bit more into balance so that they have closer to the same percentage of the carryover multiple use zone used as we start next year's runoff season. Fort Randall is currently just a little bit under the base of its flood control zone. That project is actually drawn down in the fall to 1337, so it'll continue down through November here. And then it gets refilled over the winter and that gives us some extra winter hydropower generation. Okay, so Kevin, on his earlier runoff slide, he talked about those 5 different runoff scenarios as part of our draft AOP. We take those 5 different runoff scenarios as input to our reservoir models. We simulate the reservoir regulation out into next year, and we use August 1st as the starting condition for that. So if you look at this first slide here, this is system storage. The black line is the actual system storage going back to the beginning of the year. The blue line then is the regulation for next year based on that median runoff forecast. And then we also have on here the upper and lower decile runoff conditions. The draft AOP also has the upper and lower quartile if you're interested in more information. You can also see on this slide we have the 3 green triangles. Those are the 3 system storage checks. We have the March 15th storage check, which sets the navigation service level for the first part of the navigation season. We have the July 1st storage check, which sets the navigation service level for the second half of the season and also the season length. And then the September 1st storage check sets the Gavins Point winter release level. So going back to the black line here, the actual system storage, we started right near the base of the annual flood control zone. But because runoff was so low this year, we really didn't capture much water into the reservoir systems. Kind of just held its own until we got into the middle part of summer, and then it's been steadily declining ever since. Again, you can see based on the runoff scenarios, we have a wide range of possibilities for storage next year. If we get an upper decile, which is a wetter condition, we have a possibility of recovering the reservoirs back to the base of the flood control zone. Under the median, some recovery, but if we have a continued of dry conditions continuing, then we'll have some more low storage and low reservoir levels next year. In your handout and in the presentation here, we also have the similar slides for Fort Peck and Garrison and Oahe, showing reservoir elevation rather than storage. And I won't go into as much detail on these, but you can see the same sort of pattern. Reservoir elevation is very dependent on what kind of runoff we get next year. I will stop here on Garrisons and just point out something I'll reference later when we talk about the Fish and Wildlife Project purpose. You can see on this lower decile runoff condition that Garrison is, for the most part, steady to rising during the spring period, and I'll talk about that on a later slide with regard to the fish spawn. And then this one is Oahe, again, similar kind of chart. So moving on to the individual authorized purposes here. First, talk about flood control. In 2020, our flood damages prevented by the system were $0.3 billion. We'll be working up the 2021 flood damages prevented over the next few months here. Again, going back to the earlier slides, you saw that all of the 2020 water was evacuated prior to the start of the 2021 runoff. And then this year, because we had the low runoff, we really didn't capture much additional water. We only utilized about 1% of the system's total flood control storage this year. Looking out to next year, all scenarios start next year's runoff season below the base of the annual flood control zone. Plus, we have some additional storage available in the carryover zone going into next year, which could be used for flood control operations. It's important to note, though, that flooding can still occur due to downstream rainfall events, and this is particularly true downstream of Gavins Point, and that's due to the long travel times below Gavins Point, several days travel time for a reduction in Gavins Point releases to get down to some of those lower areas of the river. And then also there's a large uncontrolled area below the system of reservoirs from below Gavins Point. Next project purpose here is hydropower. This slide shows main stem hydropower generation since 1954. Hydropower is largely influenced by the amount of runoff that we get and how much water's moved through the system. So you can see during one of our most recent long-term drought periods from about 2000 to 2007 in here, we had much lower hydropower generation. You can see during the wetter periods like in the 90s here and some of these recent years where hydropower generation is up, and that's due to the amount of water that's moving through the system. You can see this year our forecast is for 8.9 billion kilowatt hours of energy production. Next year with the median runoff, it would be about 8.1. Both of those bars on the right are lower than the long-term average, which is about 9.5 billion kilowatt hours. Moving on to the navigation project purpose. We started the year or the navigation season at full service flow support. When we got to the July 1st storage check with the system storage declining, we enacted some water conservation. As Kevin mentioned earlier, we reduced the flow support by 1,500 CFS at that time. Looking out to next year, 2022, the March 15th storage check under the median and lower runoff conditions, in other words, those drier conditions, we would start next year at minimum service flow support. If we were to get the wetter conditions, the upper quartile and upper decile, we would have something slightly above minimum service flow support next year at the first half of the navigation season. Looking out further then to July 1st storage check, if we get those two wetter runoff conditions, the upper quartile and the upper decile, we would have at least full service flow support. If we got the upper decile, we would have something above full service to evacuate water from the system. Both of those runoff scenarios have 10-day extensions to the navigation flow support, and again, that's to move water through the system. If we get the median runoff condition next year, again, we would start at minimum service likely, but when we got to the July 1st storage check, then we would raise the flow support level to 2,400 CFS below full service. Under both the lower quartile and lower decile runoff conditions, we would continue with minimum service throughout the season, and we would have shortened flow support seasons for navigation. The lower quartile shows a 7-day shortening, and the lower decile shows a 16-day shortening of the navigation flow support season. Moving on to water supply, water quality, irrigation, and recreation. These four purposes require access to water. We started off 2021 with essentially the reservoirs in pretty good shape, but as the year went on and the reservoirs started to decline, we did start to see some impacts to intakes in some of the parts of the basin. We had some concerns from the irrigators, started to see some boat ramps that needed some maintenance and cleaning some sediment off and some things like that. Kevin already talked about the Gavins Point winter releases of 12,000 CFS for this upcoming winter, and we'll be reducing flows from Gavins Point later in November down to that 12,000 level. And then looking out to 2022, again, access issues are going to be very dependent on runoff. If we get those wetter conditions, some of the concerns would probably go away. If we have continued dry conditions, then we'll probably have some issues or concerns in terms of water supply intakes, irrigation, rec areas, marinas, those types of things. We'll have some issues possibly next year. And then looking out further than that into the winter of 2022 going into 2023, we show Gavins Point winter releases of the minimum 12,000 again under the median runoff condition. So talk quickly here about fish and wildlife. Our goal is to have steady to rising reservoir levels at the upper 3 projects during the spring forage fish spawn. If we don't have runoff sufficient to keep all 3 rising, we would favor Garrison next year. And what I mean by favor is we would adjust releases at Fort Peck and Garrison to try to keep Garrison rising during that period. That's within the constraints of the other authorized purposes such as irrigation, and we have considerations for the nesting birds at that time as well. We'll try to minimize periods of zero release at Fort Randall to the extent possible during the nesting season. If we do end up on minimum service next year, that means generally lower daily average releases. That can impact our ability to eliminate these zero releases. And also during flood risk reduction measures where we have to quickly cut back releases from Gavin's Point and then Fort Randall. Sometimes we have to go to zero for some short periods. And then we'll continue to monitor cold water habitat. This was an issue during the last long-term drought, for example, at Garrison. So that will be monitored going into next year. It's always monitored, but we'll keep a little closer eye on it next year, depending on the runoff scenario. And then last, we'll talk about the threatened endangered species regulation. Start off with the piping plover and the least tern here. The least tern was actually removed from the endangered species list in 2021. We'll continue to do an adult census for the terns, but we won't be doing any additional monitoring for the tern going forward. In terms of plover activity this year, the falling reservoirs did improve the shoreline habitat for the plovers, and so we had a good plover productivity on the reservoirs, and then that habitat availability also contributed an increase in adult plovers. Looking out to next year, 2022, Gavin's Point releases a couple operations that we've done in the past here: steady release flow to target and daily release cycle. The steady release flow to target, we set a steady release from Gavin's Point at the beginning of the nesting season, which is typically about the middle of May. We would set that at some level to meet the downstream flow targets and keep the birds nesting up a little bit higher. And then if conditions dry up as we move through the summer and we need to increase releases, then we would do that. That's the flow to target portion of that. Daily release cycling we've done in the past also. That would be 1 day up at the steady release level, followed by 1 or 2 days down at some lower level. We've done cycling of releases for both a water conservation measure and then also a flood risk reduction measure. And again, those two operations will be dependent on nesting habitat next year and also any hydrologic conditions that are happening on the river at that time. We'll continue to do intraday peaking patterns from both Garrison and Fort Randall. The intraday or hourly patterns at those two projects give us some hydropower benefits, but they also give us steady stages on the sandbars where the birds are nesting downstream. And then beyond that, we'll do any other measures to minimize take for the plovers next year. And then last, I want to just briefly talk about the pallid regulation for the pallid sturgeon. The Fort Peck Dam test release final EIS was issued in late September. The comment period on that just closed recently. The record of decision has not been signed yet, but will likely be signed later in November. The test release EIS identifies and compares alternative releases from Fort Peck with the purpose of the flows to evaluate the potential for achieving pallid sturgeon spawning and recruitment on the upper Missouri River. At this point, with the criteria that's in the final EIS for those test flows, it's unlikely that we would run any test flows in 2022, and that's mainly due to the current low reservoir level at Fort Peck. And so to summarize here, water conservation measures were enacted on July 1st this past year. Again, we'll have all designated flood storage available to start 2022, with some additional storage available in that carryover zone. We'll closely monitor the mountain and plains snowpack accumulation this winter, and we'll also monitor the river and ice conditions particularly below Gavin's Point this winter with that minimum winter release. And then the service level for 2020 navigation season likely is to be below full service. At this point, it's kind of looking like minimum service to start next navigation season. With that, I will turn it back to John.
Now we are in our question and answer period. We'll start with any congressional representatives or staffer that would like to make a statement or identify themselves. Anyone else? How about any tribal representatives in the crowd? Governors or their representative? Any state agencies? With that, I don't think we had any cards, so we'll open it up. Anybody's got a question, just raise your hand and we'll answer it. We're not that good. Surely we have something. Yes, sir.
You're talking about minimum navigation flows. What does that mean for the river level at Sioux City?
That generally would drop the Sioux City stage by a foot over what full service would be. Now, presently, we're above full service flows just to meet the reduced service at Kansas City. Our flow targets are Sioux City, Omaha, Nebraska City, and Kansas City. So we're actually well above full service today.
What's the forecast for the Mississippi? Because I know that a lot of times downriver, we cut our water releases because the Mississippi is flooding.
We don't do any operations specifically for benefits to the Mississippi River. We're not authorized to do that. So we don't reduce releases in response to flooding on the Mississippi River, and we don't release extra water out of Gavin's Point to float barges on the Mississippi River. We don't do that.
Okay.
Legally, we can't do it. From a flood control point of view, it's 10 days to the mouth. By that time, the flood's over. So it's a practical situation with the flood. So good question. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yeah.
With the removal of the least turn from the endangered species list this year, how does it affect your operations below Gavin's Point? Does it broaden your parameters for operations?
It really doesn't, because the tern and the plover needed about the same conditions, and the plover is still a threatened species, so it really is not going to change that.
All right, thank you.
You've got 12,000 feet being released from Gavin's Point over the winter. Is there any scenario where that could be reduced to 9,000, or is 12,000 a stated minimum? Could you explain?
That 12,000 is the minimum release in our master manual for water supply. That's about as low as we can get with normal inflows and keep the municipal water intakes in water downriver, particularly Kansas City. There's 2 water delivery companies there, and they're about the same. If we get much below 12,000 in the wintertime, they run out of water.
You might want to explain the 9,000.
We can go, if we shorten the navigation season, say we pull a month of it off, we may go to 9,000 in November, because you're still getting a lot of tributary inflow there. But we're very conscious about our minimum flows that we need to make. I want to qualify that is that there's plenty of water in the river at 12,000 for all the municipal purposes. The utilities have to go get that water. We don't guarantee that there's access. There's plenty of water in the river, plenty of water in the reservoirs for water supply. The access to the water is the individual user's responsibility. Anything else?
Okay. I got one more
Sure,
question.
yeah, you got as many as you want.
Last year you released 12,000 feet from Gavin's Point. Is that correct?
No.
We were at 17,000 for our minimum
Right.
release last year because we have water.
Oh, I thought when I looked at the water levels in the winter, Sioux City was at about 8 feet.
It was, but that was still, we were releasing 17,000.
Really? Yes.
12,000, it'll be a little lower.
Down to 6.
6.
We have a graph. Right there.
Okay, so at 12,000, Sioux City, your stage would be between 5 and 7 feet.
So 5 is to the 12,000, 7 is to the 18,000.
So you'll be,
Thank you.
yeah.
John, you back away a little bit?
Give it the one, John.
All right.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. All right.
Do you expect, or do you make decisions on your flow releases based on downstream tributaries coming into the river? Like the Big Sioux or?
On flood control, yes, but when we're talking about water supply, it's based on water we have in storage. Those 3 storage checks that Kevin and Mike talked about, March 15th, July 1st, and September 1st. Those are storage checks, and we make decisions on basically the money we got in the bank, not what we think we're going to get in the bank. Now, as I mentioned, we're releasing more than full service flows just to meet our navigation target. I think yesterday we went down because we got a lot of rain in the lower basin, so we're able to meet those targets. But we don't do that based on what we think is happening. We actually do it based on what has happened in the lower basin. Anything else? Okay, go.
Okay. Just want to thank everybody for coming. Appreciate your engagement. Hopefully this was helpful for informing you on what we have done, what we are doing, and what we plan to do in the future. A lot of uncertainty ahead, as you've seen on the forecast, and some potential for some real problems that we'll have to work through them together. Your input is valuable. If you got any questions, comments, anything you want to talk about online after we wrap this up here in a couple of seconds, happy to stay as long as you want to make sure that you're informed or that you can provide input back to us. But again, thanks for coming, and I hope everybody has a great evening.